If you would turn to Matthew chapter 24, we'll start there. I'll start talking a little bit first about what it says in Matthew chapter 21. As Jesus was approaching Jerusalem for this final time, and of course there was, according to the books, Jerusalem normally had maybe between 100,000 to 200,000 people, but on the holy days, spring, fall, holy days, it would swell to be about 1 million people. People living not only in Jerusalem or staying there, but staying out in the countryside. There was as many as 1 million people that would come in. So this was a huge occasion. And Jesus is approaching. It talks about this in Matthew chapter 21. You don't have to turn there, but it talks about the great multitude that spread their clothes on the road. They cut down branches from trees and spread them on the road. And they said, "Hosanna, Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." This was a very special thing. Many of them recognized Jesus as the coming Messiah that would, as we know, liberate them from Rome. And it was huge. It was a big deal. And some of them who were there, of course, had come in from outside Jerusalem. When they came to the city, they were saying, "Who is this?" The multitude said, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee." They had huge expectations. And in Matthew chapter 24, we see a little bit later here, Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. Now, it sounds a little strange as we read it because obviously he was at the temple when he was 12. He's been at the temple many times. What do you mean showing him the buildings of the temple? And obviously, it seems to me, at least, that this is just bragging on these buildings, how wonderful they are. Now, I've got a resource here. I was reading a little bit about the temple itself. I won't read it all, but it was considered the temple itself had been rebuilt by Herod. It had been basically fixed up by Herod, I should say. And he had wasted no money. He put all kinds of money into it, and it was a wonder of the age. The temple of God had never been greater than it was at this time when Jesus came to live his life on earth. It was the wonder of the age. It was the jewel of Jerusalem. It was built with white marble and gold panels. It was said that it had gold and ivory that shone so brightly that you couldn't even look at the building in the middle of the day. It was just too bright. It was a wonder. And the interior was covered with ornate cedar wood with panels overlaid with gold. And the floor was overlaid with gold. I mean, just those few facts, you get an impression. This was a building unlike any building that we have ever seen. The expense, the riches, the majestic nature of this temple. Herod had obviously built it for his own ego, or fixed it up for his own ego, but it was an amazing place. And so when the disciples are looking back and saying, showing him the buildings of the temple, I just imagine what's going on here is they're imagining, hey, Jesus, you're about to take over. You know, it's going to be us ruling. And we're gonna be in these buildings. We're going to be able to experience, and this is going to be our headquarters. We can kick these Pharisees, these Sadducees out, and this will be us. We'll be in charge. And I can imagine that kind of excitement, looking back and seeing what they're going to be able to rule out of as Jesus establishes his kingdom at that time. Well, Jesus, of course, Jesus and the Father had a different plan. And Jesus' next words in verse 2 of Matthew 24, Jesus said to them, "Do you see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now this had to hit them like a ton of bricks. What? Now here they're thinking about perhaps inheriting and moving into these buildings, and he's saying it's all going away. What a statement. It had to be shocking to them. And as we know, it did. 70 AD, as Jerusalem was taken over and as it was burned. As I read accidentally, according to Josephus, one soldier set the temple afire. It wasn't supposed to be burned. It was supposed to be saved, according to Josephus. But someone started a fire and they couldn't get it put out. And as I've read in other places, there was so much gold that it melted and went down between the cracks of rocks, and the soldiers and others would pry those rocks apart to see if there was anything in there. And there literally was not one stone left upon another, just as Jesus had prophesied. They wanted everything. They wanted it gone. And the closest thing we have to it now is part of the retaining wall that held up, that Herod had built as he expanded the Temple Mount. That's the Wailing Wall now that the Jews will pray at, the closest they have to the temple. It's all gone. There's not one brick left. Notice verse 3, though. He makes this startling prophecy about this great temple being destroyed. And it says, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. And I'm sure they'd mulled this over a little bit. And now they're saying, tell us, when will these things be? And when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And obviously, if it's not going to be right now, when is it going to be? And Jesus answered and said to them, notice his first words, take heed that no one deceives you. Take heed that no one deceives you. That was the first words that he spoke as he spoke about the end of the age. We're coming upon the fall holy days, the Feast of Trumpets, the very day that pictures the return of Jesus Christ. And one of the primary points that he made about that time, that end of the age, was to take heed, take great care that no one deceives you. A couple months ago, I gave a sermon that I mentioned was going to be first one. This is the second. The first one was called Deceived by the Truth. And we talked about the idea that there are many types of truth, but sometimes true facts can lead us to wrong conclusions. We can be deceived by a partial truth when we don't know the whole story. And we went through during that sermon, we went through various reasons that people believe things. Oftentimes things that are not true, but they believe it anyway. They believe it is true. Things like perhaps they just want to believe it's true, or there's some kind of reward, benefit to them if they believe it's true. I went through that sermon. Today I would like to talk about not the idea of truth or how we can be deceived by the truth, but the concept of deception itself. Because Christ thought it important enough to warn us. And we're going to see that there are a number of warnings that are in the Scripture about false teachers, about deception. And deception has been the primary condition of humanity. For all of humanity's existence, some kind of deception is the primary thing. Let's pick up reading in verse 5. After he says, take heed that no one deceives you. He says, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Now, this can be taken two ways. Mine has a little quote here saying, I am the Christ. And certainly, we're going to talk in a few minutes about how some have come claiming to be Christ or a kind of Christ. But I think based on the wording here, that many will come in my name saying I am the Christ, it seems to indicate more likely that he's saying they will come in his name and preach that he is the Christ. And that has been the predominant thing that we've seen throughout Christian history, is preaching a different Jesus, but coming supposedly in his name, but saying he is Christ, but deceiving all along. We've seen that happening, and I think we'll see it more and more at the time of the end. Notice verse 6. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. And we see the news today and this week, and the uptick of violence in the Middle East and the attack that Israel had. And it's very sobering. And we do take heed, and we realize how easily things could just get out of control. And we live in an age where that's the case. But it says, see that you're not troubled. These things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. There have been many wars that have happened, but at some point here, the end will come. And the wars that we will see will be the end time wars. And we don't know exactly when that's going to take place. It says in verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up for tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and hate one another. And we see more of that in the world today. Hatred, betrayal. Verse 11, then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. This is speaking of an increase of false prophets at the end of the age, just before Jesus returns. Will deceive many. It says, and lawlessness will abound. They won't be teaching God's law. They may be teaching certain aspects of it, but not the complete law of God. It says, lawlessness will abound. The love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. You know, imagine that. Lawlessness abounding. We generally live in a law-abiding society. Generally, not fully, but imagine when there's much less concern about the law. People just do what they want to do. The law enforcement can't even keep up. There are some cities in this nation where that is the case. The love of many growing cold. It'd be a hard time to live. It is a hard time when that happens. And it says, he who endures to the end shall be saved. Are we vulnerable? As we sit here today thinking about that end time that we believe we're in and approaching, are we vulnerable? Are we capable of being deceived? Matthew chapter 24, verse 24, has often been cited by some as evidence that we can't be deceived, that we won't be deceived. In the King James Version, it says this, Matthew 24:24, it says, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. It says, if it were possible. Now, in our English language, as we speak it today, that is a subtle hint that it's not possible. If it were possible, but it's not, is the implication. Most modern translations, including the New King James, says it this way. It says, false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. The Greek, the original Greek, does not imply that it's impossible for us to be deceived. It implies that it is possible if we allow it. And it's an important thing for us to consider. There's going to be great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even us. So the question we ask ourselves is, how vulnerable are we? How vulnerable are we? I think it's a very important question to consider. If we're going to endure to the end, to remain faithful and receive that salvation, how vulnerable are we to deception? In the early church, in the apostolic times, Paul himself warns many times about being deceived. In fact, in Galatians, the first chapter of Galatians and verse 6, we see that some were already being deceived at that very time. So early in the church, Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6, he says, I marvel that you are turned away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. He's just amazed that they're already turning to a different gospel. It says, which is not another, it's not really another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. So church members in Galatia in Paul's day were already being deceived. Christ did not intend to say it's impossible for church members to be deceived. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and beginning in verse 3, 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, I fear. He's very concerned. I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Our minds can be corrupted. He says, I'm concerned about this. He says, for if he who preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit from which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, that you may well put up with it. He was concerned that if they hear a gospel that sounds better, sounds more intriguing, that they'll give up the true gospel and go for that. And that is what traditional Christianity has long done. Find a better message. Jesus kept the law for you. You don't have to do it yourself. It's an easy message. Oh, you die, you go straight to heaven. I mean, these kind of easy messages. That's what we see most of Christianity has accepted. 1 Timothy chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 4. And we'll just pick up in the first verse there. Again, Paul writing in this case to young Timothy. He says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith." There's a prophecy that some among God's people will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. It's very poignant about that. These deceptions out there are doctrines of demons. They're not just trifling different points of view. They're important. It's important to understand that what's behind it is the spirit of Satan. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. These are deceiving spirits that are leading some to depart from the faith and to follow doctrines of demons. I've got another verse here. You don't have to turn there, but in Acts 20, verses 29 and 30, it says that also from among yourselves men will rise up speaking perverse things and draw away the disciples after themselves. He's talking about the idea that people will come in and deceive the church. And so we know that Christ did not mean it's impossible to be deceived, because it was going on already just a few years after Jesus was resurrected and in the early days of the church. Now, regarding this, I'm going to pick up in verse 25 then of Matthew 24. It says, back to Matthew 24 in the Olivet prophecy, it says that for false Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. I see, in verse 25, see, I have told you beforehand. And we've been given a warning beforehand. We should heed. It says, therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Evidently, there are going to be some who say that Christ is here already. He has already secretly returned. Hey, we've got this inside knowledge here. What you've been told isn't true. You come with us and you'll see that the real Christ is already here. Undoubtedly, that will be going on from what Christ has to say. And it's not a new thing. There have been those who've claimed to be Christ over the years. According to Wikipedia, a Wikipedia article I read, it listed 50 individuals from the time of Jesus, 50 individuals who we know of have proclaimed themselves to be Jesus. 50. In fact, in some of our own lifetime, some of you will remember the Branch Davidian standoff back in, I think it was 1993. I see it in my notes here. The Branch Davidians were led by a man named David Koresh. And the FBI was there at a massive standoff, and unfortunately many died. And there's been a lot written about how that was handled so wrong. But David Koresh claimed to be someone special to his group of Branch Davidians. He proclaimed that he was the end-time Christ. And he had people who died with him, who would go to their graves believing this. Now, according to encyclopedia.com, he never claimed to be Jesus himself. He claimed to be a second kind of Messiah, an end-time Messiah. So in this case, it's a little bit of a twist. He never claimed to be Jesus himself, but he was an end-time Messiah. Will we see more of that? Where people claim to be the Messiah in a certain way, yet don't try to take on Jesus' identity himself? I mean, I think we're going to see everything at the time of the end. We're going to see all kinds of claims made. But unfortunately, at the time of the end, there's going to be the added element to the deception of these signs and wonders, these miracles that can be worked. Is going to be very intriguing to some. Let's go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I think that these individuals who are working, the spirit of Satan behind them, and obviously given power by the demonic world to do amazing wonders, this is going to be a very deceptive element, a very deceptive time. And if we're not prepared to see amazing things with our own eyes, it could be something that we're lured in as well. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning verse 1, it says, "Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ has come." He's warning Christians in his day not to be, don't be taken by someone who sends you this letter, even if it says it's from me, but says the time of Christ is upon us. The time of Christ has come. Christ is returning. It says in verse 3, "Let no one deceive you by any means." By any means. "For the day will not come unless the falling away comes first. The man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God and shows himself that he is God." Now, I'm not going to take time to go through every element of this, but obviously this is someone who's showing himself to be, hey, I'm the rule. I make the rules here. I'm kind of in the place of God. I'm in the place of Jesus Christ. Everyone needs to listen to me. We're going to see that. And in verse 8 it says, "Then the lawless one will be revealed." Notice, lawless, the idea of teaching things that are not according to God's law. "The lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming." So we know this is someone that will be revealed at the very time of the end. Christ will destroy this person at his return. So this happens at the very end. It says in verse 9, "The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan." Spirits are behind this. But they're going to be preaching in the name of Jesus. But it's spirits behind it. It's according to the working of Satan. Notice, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. With all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive a love of the truth that they might be saved. So this is Satan, perhaps God allowing Satan to have even more ability to work powerful miracles and show signs and wonders between Satan and the demonic realm, just allowing them more free reign at that time. And there's a tremendous amount of signs and wonders. And in fact, I'll just mention Revelation 13, verse 11. Revelation 13, verse 11 talks about a second beast who deceives the whole earth, performing great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven. There's going to be a time of deception that there's so much going on that is going to be very hard, unless we're discerning, to understand, nope, this is the working of Satan. This is not the working of God. This is the power of Satan and his demons. This is not the power of God working these signs and wonders. We're going to have to discern those things. Notice, among those who perish because they did not receive a love of the truth. I think we've all groaned over the years at having friends and loved ones who have given up the truth because they kind of would rather do something else. And they didn't have a love for the truth. They just went along with it. Some of them because they thought, well, it'll keep me out of the tribulation. They had their own reasons, of course, but they didn't develop a love for the truth. And brethren, we really need to do that. If we are not to be deceived, we must make sure that we are studying God's truth. We must make sure that we are praying to God. We're close to Him. We must make sure we're committed to obedience to Him, because these are things that will cause us to go off track and to be deceived. I would like to spend the remainder of the sermon on this concept of the characteristics that make a person vulnerable to deception. Characteristics that can make us even vulnerable to deception. What characteristics are they? Last sermon we talked about reasons people believe things that may not be true. In this case, I want to look at the characteristics that Satan can take advantage of, and that we have to consider whether these characteristics live in us, whether it's a part of us. And to do that, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 to start with, because this is the verse that talks about not being ignorant of Satan's devices. And I think for us to be able to perceive and to know, to understand the characteristics that can make us vulnerable to deception, it's important to consider this idea of not being ignorant of Satan's devices. In 2 Corinthians 2, and we'll pick up in verse 9 and read through verse 11. Remember in 1 Corinthians, Paul had put out someone from church for sexual immorality that everyone knew about, and he was unrepentant of, and he put him out of the church. Well, by this time, evidently, this person had repented. And Paul was instructing them to accept him back because he had changed, he's repented. And this is part of that discourse here. I will just pick up in the middle of it here. 2 Corinthians 2, verse 9. For to this end I also wrote that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. In other words, you're going to follow his instructions on what to do with this individual. It says, now whom you forgave anything, I also forgive. For if indeed I have forgiven anything, indeed I have forgiven anything, I have forgiven that one for your sakes in the presence of Christ. Notice he's talking about, I have forgiven this person. Now he says, lest Satan should take advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. Notice that. Satan can take advantage of us if we have certain characteristics. And we're going to talk about this first characteristic he mentions here in just a moment. But I would like to suggest as we get into this that Satan is conditioning you and me as best he can, as much as we allow him to. He's conditioning us today. It's not about whether we give up the truth right here and now. It's about getting a little foothold in us now that he can take advantage of later when the real deception comes. He will work to condition you and I today and in the weeks, months, years ahead so that when the time comes for him to pull that trigger, he can undermine our faith. Now, that's not to say that God wouldn't like us, that Satan wouldn't like us to just give it up here and today, but that's not going to happen. It's not likely. He plays the long game, the long con, if you will. He knows what he can do now to cause us to be vulnerable to when he wants that deception to take place. And that's what we need to be very careful about, brethren. He's conditioning us for that future time. So let's go through some of these points. The first point that I have comes right from 2 Corinthians 2 here. Paul says, I have forgiven. And he goes on to say, lest Satan should take advantage of us, for we're not ignorant of his devices. Point number one is one of Satan's devices, one of the ways he can condition us is the lack of forgiveness and unresolved conflict. This is what Paul is getting at when he talks about Satan's device. This is the very context of him mentioning it, is forgiveness. He's teaching here that without that forgiveness, Satan has a foothold in us. We can have unresolved conflict that whether it's grudges, harboring resentment, fostering disunity, that Satan can cause to continue until he wants to flip that switch. It causes us to take some kind of other action. We have to be careful to practice forgiveness and to resolve conflict in the way that the New Testament teaches. So that's one of the ways that we can be vulnerable to Satan's deception. Second point that I've had here, second point is selfish concern. Selfish concern. We're all selfish individuals. One of the most important things that this life teaches us is if we're converted, is we must overcome that selfish nature that we have. That selfish concern. Satan can exploit our human desires, our lusts, our weaknesses, our desires for power, for wealth, material gain. Notice in James chapter 1 and verse 14. James chapter 1 and verse 14. Oftentimes when deception is talked about in the Bible, there's a concept of selfishness that's attached to it. In James chapter 1 and verse 14, it talks about temptation and sin that ultimately leads to death. He says in verse 14, but each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Temptation comes because of a selfish desire that we have. And then when that desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. There is a progression which leads to death. There's a progression that leads to outright sin. And it begins with that selfish desire that starts in our heart. Ultimately, if we are too concerned about self, we can give up the truth. Think about the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13. We have the example of those who hear the word and accept the truth with joy, immediately accept it with joy. But it says tribulation and persecution arises because of the word. And they stumble. This tribulation and persecution, when things get bad for them, difficult because of the truth, they give it up. And I would hope that wouldn't be the case with us. But brethren, we've lived in a time that's relatively easy to live in. That's not to say we haven't had our tribulations because of the truth. There are many in the church over the years, and undoubtedly even some of you that may be facing the prospect of, will I have my job after I come back from the feast? I'm going to the feast anyway, but perhaps there's concern about the job. Because maybe even keeping the Sabbath has become, you've had to give up things. But most of us haven't really been persecuted, even physically, for our beliefs. What if that comes? Are we so concerned about ourselves that we would give up the truth to avoid the persecution? It's a very sobering question because, again, if we haven't gone through it, it's hard to imagine. But if we have a sincere, deep love of the truth, then we're not giving it up no matter what. In Matthew 13, verse 22, it talks about he who received the seeds among thorns. He hears the word, and it says, the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. In other words, again, these are selfish concerns. These riches and the cares of the world. You know, the time of the end, Ezekiel chapter 7 talks about people throwing their gold and silver in the streets. It's worthless. They can't eat it. They're starving. And the riches of this world is worthless in the end. But there are those who will care more for their selfish concerns. So that's point number 2, being overly selfish concerns. Point number 3 is failure to recognize false teachers and false religion. A failure to recognize it. Because false teachers can use very persuasive words, very persuasive language. In Romans chapter 16, beginning verse 17, 18, talks about this persuasive language that some can present things. Make it sound really good. Romans chapter 16, verse 17 says, I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses. The Greek, it can be translated, create obstacles or create arguments against the truth. It says, contrary to the doctrine which you have learned. So we've learned certain doctrines. It says to note those that create arguments against those doctrines. It says avoid them, for those who are such do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly. Now there's a selfish interest there. They want a following. It says, but by smooth words and flattering speech deceive the hearts of the simple. Smooth words and flattering speech. Now, the key there is we don't want to have a simple heart, one that just believes anything that sounds good. We want to know what we believe and why, be able to prove it. We don't want to be simple in that way, but they will use smooth words and flattering speech. Another verse I'll just refer to in Colossians 2, verse 4, it says, I say, lest anyone should deceive you with persuasive words. That's the New King James. Another translation, the English Standard Version, says plausible arguments. Well, that sounds like it could be true. You know, I've said many times, just because something could be true doesn't mean it is true. And we have to make sure something is true, not, oh, that's plausible. It sounds good. 2 Timothy chapter 4, we've read this often too. 2 Timothy 4:3 talks about a time coming when people will not endure sound doctrine. 2 Timothy 4, verse 3, time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires. Notice again that selfishness that's there. Their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. And they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. In other words, they will hear what they want to hear. We talked about that a little in the other sermon about deceived by the truth. People, they listen to what they want to listen to. And that's really all they're interested in. We have to be careful about that. We have to be careful to recognize false teaching and false religion for what it is. Even sometimes when it creeps in very subtly. That happened years ago, as we all remember. The false teachings of this world crept in very subtly. And that can certainly happen. Point number 4 then. One of the ways that we can be vulnerable to deception is we can become distracted. We can become distracted from our spiritual disciplines. There is so much in today's world to lure us away from prayer, from Bible study, those simple spiritual disciplines. There's so much to lure us away. I mean, there's entertainment at the tip of your fingers anymore. You can stream whole movie series or whatever and never take any time to study. Become so distracted by other things. We can become so busy. When we have all these helps, we have cell phones, computers, but life is busier than ever. And that's fine as long as we're remembering to prioritize our Bible study, our prayer, and making sure that we're not distracted from what's really important. It's fine to be busy. It's fine to enjoy entertainment, but we must have our priorities if we're going to not be deceived. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 tells us to be diligent. Be diligent to present yourself approved of God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That's 2 Timothy 2:15. To be diligent and to be a worker means we're not constantly distracted by other things. We're able to focus on what's important. That part of every day, we're able to focus on that. It says rightly dividing. The idea is to rightly or to accurately or correctly explain the truth. We must be diligent. We must be a worker. So that's point number 4. Point number 5 is sometimes Satan can use our emotions. He can get a foothold and cause us to be susceptible to deception by our emotions. Our emotions are powerful influences over us. Think about the first murder, when Cain's offering was not accepted and Abel's was. Just imagine, you see, even though the story is very short there, we get enough of a glimpse there. God warns Cain. It says in Genesis 4 that Cain was very angry and his countenance fell. He was very emotional about this. His offering wasn't accepted. We just can imagine the jealousy, the anger, the pride, the resentment that he may have been feeling. You just imagine that, especially for him to go to the point of killing his own brother. He became very angry and his countenance fell. It reminds me of Ephesians chapter 4. If we go back to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. (26) and 27. I believe that this is either 26 or 27. I've got it in my notes here. I didn't write exactly the right one, but Ephesians 4, 26 and 27, where it says, "Be angry and do not sin." Most human anger, I should say, leads to sin. Because we oftentimes, even as converted individuals, we don't oftentimes know how to deal with anger. We don't know the difference between righteous indignation and just anger. We oftentimes are driven selfishly by anger, and that's not righteous indignation. It says, "Be angry and do not sin." It says, "Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." In other words, when we're angry, get over it quickly. Move past it. Don't let it linger, because that gives place to the devil. It is a strong emotion, and Satan can take advantage of that. And this is very much connected with our first point, when we harbor resentments and such. This is more the emotional side of how it takes a toll. Even an emotion like discouragement. Think about that. People who've gone through prolonged trials, it can become very discouraging. A person can begin to question God's faithfulness, that lose heart, to give up. Discouragement can cause that. Loneliness, which there's more and more being written today about the loneliness in today's society. We're more connected than ever, but we're lonelier than ever because those connections are not deep. They're very shallow. These kind of things can affect us. Even the emotional appeal of false teachers. I mean, today the feel-good sermons are all over the place. People are attracted to certain churches and speakers because they make them feel warm and cozy inside, make them feel God loves me, accepts me as I am, These emotions that teachers use to get people in church. Music's very emotional. More and more churches have gone toward musical performances. There are places that we've looked at for church halls that we can't use because they don't have any light. They have blue concert lighting. That is their service, is to sing about Jesus. It's very emotional. And there's that appeal there. But it's overblown. It's focused just on that one thing. We all enjoy music, and music moves us when we hear special music. But we understand that there's more to what we're doing than just that emotional, feel-good sense. But many teachers will use that. So that's point number 5. Be careful that Satan can get a foothold by using our emotions. That's point number 5. Point number 6 is Satan can create doubt. He can create doubt. Satan likes to instill doubt about God's goodness, His promises, and His truth. Sometimes we'll hear something maybe we've never heard before, and wow, if that's true, that causes me to doubt something. Maybe God's word isn't what I thought it was. Maybe it's not as sure as I thought it was. And we have to deal, as I mentioned in a sermon some months ago, dealing with doubt. Everybody has doubts at some point. It's dealing with it that we can come on the other side of that is more faithful than ever. But Satan wants to instill doubt. Another thing, point number 7, is pride. Pride can be a way that Satan conditions us. And it can be a couple types of pride. There can be intellectual pride. We get involved with the intellectual thoughts of this world around us. There's many theologians that have ideas about the Bible. And we can start reading those high-level stuff. It's not to say that we shouldn't be very reasonable about what we believe. But sometimes there's these high-level things and the highfalutin language and the pride associated with knowing these things. Human wisdom can cause us to reject divine revelation. Obadiah chapter 1, verse 3, God says, "The pride of your heart has deceived you." The pride of your heart has deceived you. Pride can lead to deception. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 3. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 18. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18. Where Paul writes, "Let no one deceive himself." And we can deceive ourselves into thinking we're a certain way when we're not. He says, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God." There is a wisdom of the world that's all about a highfalutin type philosophy. Looking at God's word a different way. I've read books that try to analyze, kind of like Thomas Jefferson did, which verses in the Gospels are probably true. Christ said these things versus the things he probably didn't say. And in one of the books, the answer to figuring out what Christ probably did say is this: if he probably wouldn't have said it. If it's something he probably wouldn't have said, then he probably did say it. If it's something that his apostles would have wanted him to say, they probably just wrote that he said it and it didn't actually happen. This is the way these very intellectual people think. And it's not a faith. It's not based on faith. It's based on this intellectual vanity and this pride and this intellectualism that causes them to overanalyze things to the point that faith doesn't count. They don't have faith that God inspired the Bible and preserved it for us. That kind of intellectual pride can come in the way of accepting the truth. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, Colossians 2, verse 8, it says, "Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world and not according to Christ." There's philosophical arguments out there that can cheat us from the truth. We have to be careful about. Remember, there was a partial pride that caused Eve to be deceived when Satan told her that her eyes will be open and she'll be like God, knowing good from evil. That was a kind of pride that he drew on. And so that can be something that we stumble on. Another thing is spiritual pride. Spiritual pride, when we feel superior to others. Our spirituality or our moral standing is so much more righteous than someone else's or some other group of people. Our self-righteousness can lead us to judge others. And remember, the Laodicean church was told those words, "Because you say I am rich." You take that in the sense they felt pretty good about themselves. You say I'm rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. It's easy to deceive ourselves into thinking that we have what it takes spiritually and not see truly where we are. So be careful about that pride. Pride can certainly be something that we stumble on. Point number 8 then. Point number 8, I think, is very important in this modern age that we live in. Satan can condition us to give up the truth at some point in the future because of, here's the point, the normalization of sin. The normalization of sin. It's a subtle process that repeatedly being exposed to sin, to sinful behaviors, to immoral actions around us in society can cause us to begin to think they're not that bad. They're normal. We've seen this with certain sexual sin in the last decade. In just a short period of time, things that used to be considered sinful because the Bible said it was sin, now it's accepted as perfectly fine. And you're strange if you think something's wrong with it. Even conservatives have begun, even social conservatives have begun to give in on some of these principles. And it's sad to see, but it's the idea of normalization. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, "Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits." That's 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. Another translation says, "Bad company ruins good morals." Or bad company corrupts good character. When we are around people, friends, or a society where we're seeing so much sin, we begin to think it's normal. That happened with Lot. Now, Lot was saved from Sodom because there was still something God saw that he deserved to be saved from that. But it's interesting that he chose to live near Sodom. Now, of course, there was a selfish interest. It was greener. There could be more riches there. But that greener area also meant more of a proximity to sin and to those who were practicing such. Sodom was known for its wickedness. And in Genesis 19, Lot called the men of Sodom brothers. So even though he hadn't given in fully to that sinful nature of theirs, there had been some compromise. And we see that when he offers his daughters. We see how he had compromised. He wasn't where he should be. God still saved him from that, but there had been compromise. And that's what happens when we live in a wicked society. That's why we have to be careful what we allow ourselves to be entertained by, and what even we see in the news, what we allow ourselves to be influenced by. If it seems normal to those around us, it can become normal to us as well. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 and We'll pick up verse 5 through 7. Ephesians 5, verse 5 through 7. Talking about the concept of the sins that we see in the world that we can begin to think is normal, that we can justify in our own hearts and minds. It says, but know this, no fornicator or unclean person. Well, it's normal today. What's a big deal? Fornication? We're not married? Well, is that such a big deal? According to God, it is. It says, no fornicator or unclean person, nor covetous man. That's covetous. I want to get more and more. Who is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words. Now, the context here is deceiving us so that we begin to practice some of the things of the world, thinking we can be spiritual. It says, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not be partakers with them. Lot had become to be influenced by those around him. And brethren, it's so difficult. We have to be so careful to draw a distinction between what we think is right because of the Bible and what the world thinks is right because they're just going along with the way Satan's pulling them. They're going along with the immoral ways, and it becomes normal. We must make sure that we don't see sin as just normal. Sin is wrong, and God is against it, and God is coming back to save the world from the repercussions of that sin, and we must make sure we want no part of it. So that's point number 8. Point number 9, separation from fellowship. Satan can use our separation from fellowship to weaken our faith, to weaken our bonds with one another. Fellowship and moral support is vital to our spiritual growth and endurance. And we know that as we read in Hebrews 10, verse 25, it says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as we see the day approaching. We're very familiar with that verse. But that is something Satan can use, to where we're separated. We're not involved as much as we need to be. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 8. Very important verse here in terms of not being deceived and Satan taking advantage of us. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 says, be sober. You know, this world, people just want to be everything but sober. Be sober. You know, see things the way they are. Realize what's really going on. It says, be vigilant. Be careful. It says, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. I was reading in a National Geographic magazine about the way lions hunt, and I won't go into all that. It's very fascinating, but bottom line is they're very tactical. They are looking for those animals who are on the edge of the herd, those who are hurting, those who seem like they're vulnerable. And those are the ones they go after because there's a greater chance of being successful. And it says Satan is like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Satan wants to find those of us who want to be on the fringe, don't want to be really part of the group. Satan is looking for that. For those who are on the edges of the herd, so to speak, on the edges, on the fringes, that behavior makes us more susceptible, makes us more of a target for Satan because he feels that we're more easily an easy prey because of that vulnerability. We don't want to be targeted by Satan any more than we are. So let's make sure that we value these relationships that we have and being together as much as we can as God's people. And the final point I have here is be careful with incremental compromises. Incremental compromise. Satan oftentimes wants us just to compromise a little bit. You know, that's not really right, but hey, what's a little? If I do it once, what's the big deal? You know, we know it's wrong, but hey, there's this technicality. Surely God would understand because of what? whatever it is we're thinking. It's easy to incrementally compromise, and seemingly insignificant compromises leads to gradual erosion of faith and convictions. Seemingly insignificant compromises leads to gradual erosion of faith and convictions. Oftentimes, that's the way Satan works, is through small steps, not grandiose big leaps, but small things that we begin to do, we depart from the faith. Paul tells us a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Just takes a little bit to start, but it grows. And that's the same way compromises. Compromises will grow into more and more compromise. So with these 10 points, these are ways that we can be vulnerable. I'm sure there are more, but these are ways that we can think about, are we vulnerable to any of these? Do any of these ring true for us? Now, hopefully we don't look and say, well, I'm terrible at all of them. I don't think we are. But I'm sure that all of us, at least in one or several of these ways, could look at ourselves and say, I need to grow there. I need to grow there because this is a foothold Satan could get in my life that he can take advantage of. He can exploit later on, especially when things get tough. So what can we do, brethren? What can we do? Well, first of all, as I said, recognize our vulnerabilities. Analyze ourselves, especially during these fall holy days. Are we vulnerable to deception in any of these ways? That's point number one. Point number two, what can we do is seek God's protection. We can't do it on our own. We must seek God's protection. In Psalm chapter 43, verse 1, it says, "Oh, deliver me from the deceitful and unjust man." It's a prayer. Deliver me from the deceitful and unjust man. We need to seek God's protection because we can't do it by ourselves. And point number three, what can we do? Develop a true and deep love of the truth. We cannot remain faithful to the end unless we do what it says in 2 Thessalonians 2:10. That's develop a love for the truth. And as I believe I heard Mr. Johnson say in one of his sermons on this some time back, it's not just loving the truth and loving all these other ideas, but it's loving the truth first and foremost. It's putting it the top of the list. It's not just one thing we love. It is the thing we love most, is the truth that God has given to us. The truth of God, of His future, of His calling, of His kingdom, all these things. And then finally, brethren, what must we do? Make sure that we are practicing righteousness. Practicing righteousness. John tells us in 1 John 3:7, "Let no one deceive you. He who practices righteousness is righteous." He who practices righteousness. That's what we need to be doing. Let's conclude over in 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. Second Timothy chapter 3. Where it says, "But evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. But you must continue in all things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them." There's an important point there. Brethren, we have been taught the truth. We must continue in that. And we must be unwavering in that. That's not to say we can't grow in our understanding, but we have the truth that God has opened our minds to. Let's realize that there are imposters who want to deceive us and want to draw us away from what we have learned and what we have been assured of. Satan is the arch deceiver. He's brilliant in what he does. We must never take for granted that we are called and therefore we're undeceivable. We must always be striving to make sure we're not susceptible to his devices. And it's so important that we understand that to be in God's kingdom, we must analyze ourselves, to think about this, and be ready for deception that is coming, because it is an arch deception that is coming. But the other side of that, if we remain faithful, is what we celebrate at the Feast of Tabernacles, a time in which all the world will begin to come out from under this deception,
And we can see the happiness and the joy in their lives because they're no longer living it. The changed lives that we'll experience when we think about what happens in the millennium. We have the opportunity to do it now. Brethren, let's act on Christ's words where he tells his disciples, "Take heed that no one deceive you."